Yeah, and it's quite interesting that also have a lot of units that were trained in desert warfare initially, and then they end up in Burma, which is quite different for them.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. At the beginning of the war, the Indian Army was being trained for deployment to North Africa. You
Yeah.
know, that the expanding Indian Army was for that purpose. So the 17th Indian Division, who are sent to Burma during the retreat when the Japanese first invade, you know, they have been completely trained with their not armored, sorry, their mechanized tail, you know, vehicle logistics and so on. And it's completely unsuited, you know, after 1942, when once Slim gets control of the army properly by the middle of 1943, by that point, he's completely overhauling the system so that it's completely, well, it's either man carried supplies or pack animals. So in particular, mules. That's how they're doing the logistical service, because it's just in the jungles of southern and also northern Burma and the border with India, you know, the frontier region between India and Burma. It's just geographically completely unsuited to vehicle logistics. And so they get rid of it. But in 1942, that's what everybody was prepared for. And it's what goes so wrong for them, because they're stuck to the roads and the Japanese are using the jungle as a way to outflank every single defensive position that the Allies end up fighting over.
Yes, and of course, in the early phase of the Pacific War, so 6 months in, the overwhelming success of the Japanese Imperial Army, especially in Southeast Asia, it builds this kind of image of the superhuman Japanese jungle night fighter. And this actually instilled some fear into, the British, the American forces in the Philippines and such, that they were honestly, they were going from very racist beliefs prior to this, mind you, where they thought the Japanese couldn't do things like fly at night, they would be prone to seasickness, have issues with their brains in such a way that it didn't
All those things.
all those things. But now they believe that the Japanese are superhumans and they can do all these things and that they are proficient at night fighting and jungle warfare, which the jungle warfare, I would argue, not so much. Night fighting, yes, they trained specifically for that. But when General Slim finally, like you says, gets his hands on the leadership role because he's thwarted by many characters, like Noel comes to mind, and
Yeah,
other
yeah,
people. Oh yeah, him famously. But it's Slim who actually gets them to learn some basics in the jungle warfare. Don't let the Japanese flank and go to your rear. Stand your ground. Do not don't route right away in a lot of ways. But yeah, he really was the guy that kind of strung everybody together and gave them that punch. But for the Burma campaign, for I guess for my audience who might not know anything about it, more or less, there's basically four phases of it. As you've alluded to, the beginning is the Japanese completely running them right out of Burma, right to India, taking Rangoon everywhere that was a significant city. The second phase is failed attempts to try and mount an offensive back against the Japanese. The third attempt is something I covered recently, the insanity that was General Renya Mutaguchi trying to invade India, and that opens the door to so many casualties that at the end, where your book will come into it, the Allies can actually launch a proper offensive, and for I guess the first time, they will have air supremacy, armored supremacy at that matter. They're fighting on equal, if not superior terms against the Japanese, and it's the Japanese for once who are collapsing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, so one of the big things about that is that when when Mutaguchi, and you covered this anyway, but when Mitaguchi invades India, one of the things that Slim is doing is choosing specifically to give up ground
Yeah.
to fight on territory of his own advantage. So the Imphal plain, he can use lines of internal communication to rush things like the Third Carabiniers, the main tank regiment that fights at Imphal, to all different sort of wheels, sort of points of the compass, depending where the biggest Japanese threat is, and other reinforcements and so on. And his use of air power to resupply. You said, we were saying about how, you're not, like, if you're surrounded by the Japanese, well, they're also surrounded because they're behind you and you've got allies on the far side of them. So it's just a mindset shift.
Mhm.
And because we have air power to make up the difference, we can drop everything we need onto the Imphal plain, whereas the Japanese have got hundreds of miles of mountain and jungle that they need to actually resupply through, and it's why the Japanese take so many casualties. So many of their casualties are actually they're actually from starvation. And to a degree, disease, which again comes down to the lack of logistical services and evacuation services and so on. And that's what creates this sort of opportunity that Thunder Run comes into. So, like, I begin Thunder Run really with the end of Imphal, because that story's been told lots and lots of times in books and so on, and I want to tell something new. And the crucial decision that Slim makes, the Japanese lose 30,000 dead and 23,000 wounded there. It's the biggest defeat that the Japanese suffer in the war, really, like individual battle, because obviously the Pacific Islands don't have that many troops in a lot of cases. Philippines would be a different example, but in an individual single battle over a couple of months. And so what happens is instead of Slim seeing out the monsoon, which starts during the battle towards the sort of the middle of the battle, so half the battle is fought in these horrific monsoons, which, they get something like, I think I've read somewhere it's something like 600 millimeters, something like that. I might be getting my stats wrong now. I can't think of it. It's a crazy, crazy number how much they get per day in the monsoon, per day. And all of the problems that has, the fact that it's mountainous terrain and jungle at the same time, the rivers and the mountains that run sort of against the direction you want to travel, the fact that makes you easy to canalize down different routes that the Japanese can fight withdrawals down. But Slim takes the opportunity that, he knows how many the Japanese have lost. Not in a literal sense, but, they've seen the bodies, they've seen the actions, it's been reported to him. And so his decision is, once the Japanese are clearly retreating, instead of seeing out the monsoon, rebuild his army and so on, because his army has got bigger, because the Indian army has continued to expand, 2.5 million men, all volunteers by 1945, although obviously some of them were in Europe, in Italy at that point. He is able to continue the battle through the monsoon and still wrest some of the divisions from, so the 17th Indian Division, who I mentioned earlier, they fight at Imphal, but they are rested whilst another of the divisions, the 5th Indian Division, who had fought in a couple of battles already in 1944, they continue fighting whilst other units are resting, and they push the Japanese back to the border with Burma because they're at their weakest, because of all the casualties and during the monsoon. And it's not just them, sort of one of the forgotten things. And again, my first big chapter, my first main chapter is about the 11th East African Division, who do the same thing. So it's African soldiers with British officers fighting down the Kabul Valley, which is another route out of Imphal to the Burmese border. But it's this amazing thing where, they are trudging through this rain and jungle. It's the cliche of what the war in Burma is at that point. Tooth and nail stuff with the remnants. And whilst they're fighting the first reinforcements, because the Japanese do bring in reinforcements to Burma, coming from a couple of different sources. Some come from China, some come from Thailand, and so on. And some from Japan as well. They run the gauntlet of American submarine blockade. So they bring about 30,000 troops. So they've lost 53,000 in Imphal, and there are obviously losses up in the Hukong Valley against the Northern Combat Area Command. There are losses in Arakan, but they do take on 30,000 reinforcements at this point. So it's not like the whole army is defeated, the whole system. It's not the end of the war. There is a long way to go. And so they push through these valleys, and eventually they cross the Chindwin, and it's the longest ever Bailey Bridge that's ever been built, until about 6 weeks later, which is annoying because then the Canadians build one in over the Rhine, which is about 400 yards longer, 500 yards longer. But the first really big one is on the Chindwin. And that's, again, it's an amazing thing because they have to go over 2 mountain ranges to get this Bailey Bridge to the front line, Kohima and then Imphal. There are sort of 2 mountain ranges, and then build it at the end of the logistical supply line. And then they break into northern Burma. And this is where the geography changes, because once you're over the Chindwin and over a low set of hills to the east, you have got this dry central plain. It's almost desert-like, near enough, And Slim is desperate to fight the 1945 battle here on this northern part of the central dry belt, because obviously big open desert, tank warfare, air power, ground attack aircraft and so on will come into their own here. You know, they've got 105 millimeter Priest self-propelled guns. Again, this is perfect terrain for these people to be charging around the desert or desert in inverted commas, I suppose, because it's not literally a desert, but charging around these deserts, encircling the slower moving Japanese, who are primarily a light infantry army, encircle them, destroy them. And that's the whole point, is Slim is out to destroy them. And that central plain is perfect. You know, that's what he wants to do. And that's the point of 1945.
All right. I guess at this point, I would ask, what is, if I'm a general audience member, what is the value of a location like Mandalay or Meiktila in the grand scheme of things?
So, I mean, interestingly, what happens that leads up to it is that originally Slim is going straight for Mandalay. That's his original plan, because it's the most sort of famous place, really.